with this presidency, if I can finish with that remark. Thank you.
Let me answer the question a little bit more narrowly. Go back to the original question: should NATO transform its approach in large to involve perhaps piracy controls in the Gulf of Aden? On the question of enlargement, our position, this is enlargement with Ukraine and the Caucasus. We'll talk about. Our position is that NATO is ready when these countries are ready. There's a membership accession program, the MAP, and there's a pre-MAP process to be ready even to start with this program to accede to NATO. When they're ready, then we're ready. But we're not going to push them. It's not in our interest to go force the issue. Certainly Ukraine, for example, 3 years ago was much closer psychologically, politically than it is right now. It's quite far away. Very interested in the EU because the EU involves transfers of money. It's not so interested in NATO right now. So the question of should we enlarge, really that has to do with who we would enlarge to. I do disagree with one particular point that our eastern neighborhood is the same as, say, the southern neighborhood. Exporting European values to Moldova, Ukraine, the Caucasus is the same as Libya, Morocco. Moldova, Ukraine, and the Caucasus are Europe. So it's exporting Europe to Europe. So I would make a small disagreement with that direct comparison. On the issue of larger missions, about the piracy control, in the answer as an example, the reason NATO is involved in the Gulf of Aden with piracy controls, the Aliantia operations, is because the targeted ships are almost entirely either owned or come to ports or carry cargoes owned by NATO member countries. Okay, so we see this piracy on the ships is directly affecting our interest and this brings the bigger question of why NATO is NATO, why not some sort of ad hoc thing? That's because NATO already exists. And so that means we have to watch very carefully for what the U.S. would call mission creep. We have this capability in NATO, both political and military capability, this headquarters capability. And does that mean because it can do something, it will keep doing more things over time? So to get back to the central question you're asking, NATO is first and foremost an Article 5 institution. First and foremost. I think it should do these other things because they are in the interest of alliance members to do. They are security-related threats to the alliance. But it's very necessary to do what we did last year. Poland did with the NATO new strategic concept. Say, let's go back to first principles for a second. Let's make sure that we still are providing for the territorial defense needs of our member states, that we haven't gobbled up other missions. So I think we need to do these things, but we need to have some sort of review process, some sort of internal process to make sure we don't have mission creep. And I would say also, final point, there's Article 5, but there's also Article 4 of the Washington Treaty, which is a broad political statement of mutual goals and aspirations. There are many things we can do with NATO beyond simply Article 5. I'm just saying that kind of as a traditionalist, Article 5 is the core interest of the alliance.
Thank you very much. Proszę Państwa, teraz pytanie z sali do naszych prelegentów. Myślę, że poruszyliśmy bardzo wiele różnych kwestii i w związku z tym proszę pytać, wyjaśniać oczywiście w języku angielskim bądź polskim. Tutaj nie ma problemu. Yeah?
Well, this is not a question, this is a comment. I'm from Faculty of International Studies and Political Science, and I would like to draw attention on the case of Libya, because it is, I think, quite interesting in respect of all these things which we touched upon today. And it seems that we have the case of some kind of a popular uprising, which is brought down by the tyrant, like in the Spring of Nations in the 19th century. And still, as we know, NATO is not going to intervene. Yesterday, Secretary General of NATO was declaring that unless there should be some kind of international support, there will be no such intervention. And this support means the support of the political bureau of Communist Party of China and probably Putin as well. So we should not expect something like this. So we should not expect intervention. And I think that the moral case, because you were saying one of the prelegents were saying about the morality in politics, I think that the moral case of this situation is quite obvious, that something should be done in this case. We should not wait and see bombarded by the Air Force of the Taiwan. And I think that it has some kind of reference of the Polish situation, because I do not think that, I can agree with Dr. Żurawski that we should not expect some kind of invasion of Western Europe, but I can imagine in the future, not very distant, that Russia may use, for example, Belarus as proxy and to provoke some military provocation, which is going to test the ability of Poland to defend itself, and I doubt highly whether we have this ability, considering the state of military affairs in Poland. And second, the political will of NATO to intervene, and I do not expect that Germany and Paris is willing to die for Białystok, for example. And the only question is whether the America is going to do something with this case, but after Georgia, I do not think that we should be very optimistic. Thank you very much.
May I respond? A couple of interesting points, and maybe I'd like to respond from our perspective. On the comparison of what's happening in North Africa with 1848, the revolution, those revolutions had different focuses. Some were specifically against Habsburg power, some were democratically oriented. All eventually came to no particular end, did not have fulfillment for many decades later. I don't know if that's a good comparison to what's happening in North Africa, because we don't really know the full content or political agenda, how radical the anti-government forces are in each of these countries. Is 1848 the right comparison or not? We just don't know. If we did know that, it would certainly help clarify our actions. We would know who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and it would be easier to make those choices. But I have heard that comparison before. As far as what our policy is with NATO, U.S. policy, and I would say this goes right to the Secretary of State, our policy is that NATO needs to do contingency planning right now. Not because we decided NATO needs to act, but if we do decide, if we as an alliance decide NATO needs to act, it needs to be able to act. So it needs to, right now, at least do the detailed planning and unification of force structure if something had to happen in Libya. And I think what you would see is, I think Rasmussen is right. There's no stomach on anyone's side to say we're going to go in there and intervene in the sense of troops in the ground, what we did in Afghanistan, or something like that. But if an unfolding humanitarian disaster occurs and we have the means to do something through no-fly zones or some other option, we would like to know that we had done the preparation to at least have it available to decision makers. Decision makers may not use that policy option, but they'd like to at least be able to consider it. And unless we as NATO do the detailed sort of organizational planning, we take that option off the table. We want to keep it on the table. That's really our position is. And we like Poland, we like other partners to support the idea of at least going through the drill of planning and identifying forces. On the issue of Russia, invasion, Belarus, that whole scenario, everyone's heard the quote from positives about war being a continuation of policy by other means, right? That means there are a lot of activities involving policy up to and short of war, and you're absolutely right. The movement of military forces to influence behaviors is certainly an article of statecraft that could occur once again in this part of the world. And certainly want to have the means, the material, the equipment here to counter if it does occur. The question of who would come to defend Białystok. I remember when I came here in 2008 and the invasion of Georgia, you would hear this from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Well, you didn't go to Georgia's aid, you wouldn't come to our aid. But Poland is an Article 5 member of NATO. Georgia is not. Okay? So I don't think that's a very good comparison. But Georgia, we didn't really know what we wanted to do. We know we didn't like what Russia was doing. We wanted to oppose that. We weren't quite sure what our obligations were or what Georgia's ability to work within our obligations was. With Poland, we are a long-term member of NATO. We have joint military forces. We work together. We do exercises on Polish territory. And it's a question, would Americans come to die for Poland? This was always the phrase before the Second World War in the United States in our isolationist circles was, who will die for Danzig? That was the idea that no American wanted to go die for Danzig. And I really like Wałęsa emerged out of solidarity into post-communist Poland. He had this phrase in one of his speeches that if you're not willing to die for Danzig, then pretty soon you'll die for London, or die for Paris, or die for Washington. I think that our view of our interests is that it's in our interest to protect our alliance members, and that we prefer to play an away game doing it than to defend shores. So I don't think it can quite so easily be said that Americans would not be willing to defend Polish interests, because I think we would see them as mutual interests at that time. So maybe I'm not as skeptical as you are of what we can actually do. And I would say finally on that, you know, if the United States is not prepared to come to the assistance of Poland with the treaty guarantees that we have, can you think of any other country who would? I think we're the most willing and able of any country. So I would say that maybe you should be quite skeptical of our political will and the contingency involving Poland's actual security. But maybe my other panelists might have comments or